Welcome to this week's episode of Uncontested Investing. This is my co-host, Suzanne Andreessen, and I'm Nate Zielinski. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode. Suzanne, today we're in the risk management and due diligence theme. We've had some amazing guests, whether you guys have seen the episodes, whether they're about to come out. We've had Alex Fossil from Property Shield, Ren Richards from Seek Now, and Alex Glickman from Gallagher Insurance. So with so many experts on this topic, they make our job easier.
Sure.
Today, we're going to discuss, though, due diligence essentials for new properties, somewhat of a checklist that every investor should be going through when deciding if this property is right for them or not.
You know, this has always been near and dear to my heart, and it's something that we as a company do in our newsletter every time we have a broadcast on Monday and Thursday. The lead story of the asset, we have 6 due diligence models underneath that asset showing how it's performing in certain components in the market. And I think it's very important that every investor gets in the habit of doing it. Yep. You want to unveil the potholes and make sure that you have the opportunity to see what they're about. And it's just, you try not to learn from your mistakes, learn from somebody else.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And that's why due diligence is at the forefront of the conversation, right? Because it's exactly that. Its importance stems from other people making mistakes. Year over year, deal over deal, people have been doing things that have come back to bite them, and they've tried to pass on the right information so people can avoid that. So that's kind of where this episode stems from, especially if you're trying to acquire a new property. There's some really important things that you should be aware of that you need to check off the list before you can proceed.
So, if you're looking at, reviewing the property listings and the disclosures, you want to make sure, one, that it's been signed on both sides of the equation, that not only the selling party has put the disclosure in, but also the buying party has the opportunity to accept them. Yep. And that gives you really the groundwork for holding somebody accountable when they say, oh, there's never been water in the basement, and the first rainstorm, there's an inch of water down there. Well, something's not factual in that disclosure.
That doesn't add up.
But it gives you an out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I should say an out, a way to rectify it.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's where, doing your due diligence and really, this is the time to dot the I's and cross the T's to protect yourself.
There's key objectives when you're talking about due diligence, right? So confirming compliance, like you mentioned, that's step number one. Is the deal signed on? Are both parties agreeing to this legally? Definitely step one. You're also assessing risk of taking on the property, like potential water damage or things of that nature that have happened in the past, and then verifying the property details, right? So gathering basic property information, I think, is step one when you're talking due diligence. Location, size, zoning, all those things. Do all those add up? Are they accurate with what the listing told you? Being able to go a step further and verify those is extremely important. And then usage restrictions, right? You might have a beautiful set of land, property already built on it, and your goal as an investor is to expand upon that. But it might be somewhere in, county lines or state lines that what you want to have for this long-term vision of this property isn't feasible by law. So doing that due diligence up front and seeing what your potential opportunities or possibilities are with the property is very key to do at the beginning.
Well, and it's town by town ordinance. So you have to, even the abutting town can have a very different ordinance based upon their development plan, but also verifying that all of the work that's been done in the house has been permitted, so you don't have to undo it. And there's, I mean, you see all these shows, on the fixing houses out in California where the electric wasn't approved by the contractor, and all of a sudden you have to tear the walls down. That's a very expensive fix.
Yes.
So you want to make sure that if the garage was permitted to be turned into living space, is that on record? Pull the property cards from the town hall, the tax information, and that should show you, match the tax card to the permit card and make sure that all of that information lines up.
This preliminary research is so necessary for exactly that. A step further is market analysis, right? So look at neighborhood trends. How long are properties typically staying on the market for? Is this a desirable area to live? Comparable sales can help you determine an accurate price point. And future development plans. Is the market trending up or down in the area that you're looking for? So are you going to get this property at a discount, or are you going to have to get in before the property value skyrockets because the market's trending up? So it's not always a definitive no if the market is trending down a little bit. It's just super important for an investor to be aware of that so they can make an informed financial decision.
But also in some of your due diligence is doing your homework and finding out, we see outside of Dallas, Texas, that Toyota is building a huge plant there. Well, if you knew that prior to that announcement, that's certainly some pretty good information. So you want to make sure that you're listening to what's being put out into the newspaper and the local news as you're starting to expand your portfolio, because these are key indicators that are going to provide more value, more uplift in an asset.
Exactly.
And I think those are great strategies to try and get on, get into practice of looking at.
Yep. And then for market analysis, the next jump is going to be title and legal checks. Very important to get these in a row. Conducting title searches to see, is the person that is selling me this property the one that actually owns it? What other liens or potential financial hurdles are in this property's history? Getting all that information helps you make a well-informed decision. Property could look beautiful from the outside, could look beautiful online, but then once you start digging into the history of the transactions, you realize that this property is actually a nightmare, and it's probably in your best interest to stay away. It's a tough decision to make, but if you have the right info, it's the one you need to make.
Sure, and you can't get emotionally attached. But you also want to look at, like a mechanics lien, and these can become points of negotiation. If there's a, $2,700 mechanics lien, well, you say, fine, this is the price I was going to give you, but now I see there's a mechanics lien. I'm taking the $2,700 off that because that's your obligation, not mine. So, this is not the end all be all. Your homework continues as things start to unveil.
Yep. And it goes a little step further than title, but verifying property boundaries and survey accuracy. So it's something as minor as that, but if you're getting maybe, a quarter less or a half less acreage than is listed online, that's a pretty significant price point difference. And you're saving yourself a lot of money if you're doing that due diligence ahead of time and figuring out exactly what the boundaries are and, where your property begins and ends.
What happens if your garage is on your neighbor's property? Which happens.
Yeah.
When the survey realizes that either you're not in the 10-foot setback or 15-foot setback, all these things that you're starting to see, the survey is going to tell you. And there's things, there's ways to, cure that. Whether you do a gift take on some land with your neighbors, like I need 10 feet here, I'll give you 10 feet here. And, and there could be some easy solutions, but there may not be. And again, sometimes you just have to walk away.
Yep. And it's important that you have those checks in place so you can determine whether or not it's a fix or a workaround that you want to pursue, or you can just, clean your hands there and walk on to the next property. As for physical inspections, structural assessments are massive when you're talking about due diligence, right? This is the overall health, the heart and soul, pretty much the organs, if you will, of your investment property. Talking about foundation, roof, walls, and the overall integrity of the property. It's massive that these get inspected before you move in. You really need to make sure that the property is going to be there standing long enough for you to turn a profit on it.
Indeed. Well, and if it, if it's an older asset, is it, knob and tube wiring? What are the things that your insurance company, when you buy it, you want to make sure not only have you taken possession of it, but is it insurable? There's things that you want to make sure that, as you go down that path, that you've protected yourself, in the flood zone. Nowadays, you have to, all properties have to have a flood map. And we've seen some crazy flooding these days, but I think at least whether you have to have flood insurance. What are the things? And these are just, it's not that it's not doable. It just, does it make your ROI really work in the end? If you have to add in more insurance.
Yep. And again, it goes back to that conversation of how much are you willing to put into this as an investor, right? If the house needs a new roof, okay, maybe that's not a definitive no for you, but now you buy it at a discount because the roof is over 20 years old. You're going to have to replace it within a few years of you owning that property. So that all goes back to the bottom line and allows you to save a little bit of money because you can reduce the purchase price once you have all the information.
Or did the inspection show that not only does it need a new roof, but now it has a little mold from a leak, black mold? And is there more cleanup that, now that you've seen some of that? So you need to be prepared to really make a full determination at the end of the inspection.
System inspections are important. Are important too. You're talking about electrical, HVAC, plumbing. Are all these things working properly? That's something you're going to want to know upfront before you buy a new investment property.
Especially the HVAC if you're in the South.
Yep.
Those aren't cheap. If a compressor goes, that's not a cheap fix. You want to know the life expectancy. You certainly want to have a good inspection company that knows how to test those systems.
Yeah, exactly. And then moving on to everybody's favorite topic, it's zoning and regulatory compliance.
That's my favorite.
I kid, but it's important to know about it. It seems boring to the average listener, but for you as an investor looking to expand your portfolio, it's stuff like this that's going to matter in the long term and decide whether or not this property is a plus for you or a minus in the portfolio in the long run.
And it behooves you to meet with the code enforcement officer who issues the building permits. And you say, I'm not going to do this today, but I'm thinking about doing it tomorrow. Is that acceptable? And you want to make sure that, that it falls within that time frame.
Yes.
They may say, I can give you a 1-year permit on there, but you have to start the approval process within that first year, or you have to come through and do it all over again. And zoning rules change. Every year they change. And sometimes they're statewide and sometimes they're townwide.
Yep, this should be on every investor's checklist. It's confirming zoning designations, permissible uses of the property. As we mentioned, if you want to change it from a duplex to a 4-unit, is that possible? If you want to change it from a single family to a multifamily, understanding local building codes and permit history, all these things matter. And then you're ensuring future development and renovations are compliant or even possible. If you're going through all that checklist, it really lets you know, okay, what can I do with this property in the long run? Or do I have to keep it exactly as it is so I'm conforming to the zoning regulations?
And sometimes taking it just as simply, you think, a 2-family to a 4-family is not a big deal. It is if they all of a sudden say you have to put in sprinkler systems.
Yes.
So there's so many things that could be that you're thinking not a big deal, but it is a big deal when you have like a sprinkler system. It's very expensive. So, making sure that as it is today, is it compliant, and can this work tomorrow if I make a change?
And before we take our first break of the episode, I want to touch on a topic that I think everybody's ears will perk up when they hear this, but it's important: financial due diligence for investors. So you're reviewing property taxes, assessments, potential special assessments, the list goes on, but this really cuts into your ROI and is going to make sure or make you aware whether or not this is a profitable investment property. The financial due diligence is some of the most important work that an investor can do before buying a property.
And these really creep in usually when you're moving into either a controlled community subdivision or a condo. If special assessments could be they may not have enough money and they have a roof or a painting job in a condo, and that could be, you could have a $14,000-$15,000 assessment that you weren't expecting on the horizon. But the other piece about a condo, and I know a lot of you probably know this already, but you want to make sure if you're going to do it as a rental that it's allowable in the bylaws of the condominium or in the complex of where it is. But 2, it may be allowable, but they're already at their maximum quota.
Yeah.
So it's that's based on a ratio perspective.
Yep.
And so those are things that you need to really understand before you make a definitive decision on this.
Yep. And I think it's a little bit different for a long-term rental versus a fix and flip, but estimating ongoing operational costs and expenses, right? So if it's a 30-year long-term rental, it's things like, what do the bills look like every month? What is the energy? Things of that nature. Or if it's going to be a heavy overhaul fix and flip, what does that look like? How much is that going to cost me? Is it going to be worth it to get that property to a certain number so I can charge this amount for rent? Then the discussion leads to, can I get a tenant at that rental rate? So you really have to have so many conversations with yourself from a financial perspective to make sure that all your bases are covered, so the bottom line stays pretty healthy.
And then and if you're doing a renovation, that you're not pricing yourself out of the value of the house. Are you putting more into it than you're going to be able to get out of it either in a sale or in a rental?
We have so much more important information to discuss. Suzanne and I will catch you on the other side of the break. Stay tuned for this week's episode of Uncontested Investing.
See you soon.
RCN Capital offers flexible loan programs designed to help wholesale partners close their clients' deals faster. From fix and flip properties to long-term rentals, new construction, and multifamily investments, we provide your clients with the funding solutions they need. With competitive terms and a quick approval process, we make it easy to focus on growing your business while we handle the financing. Learn more or apply today. Click the link in our bio or email info@rcncapital.com. Let RCN Capital help take your wholesale deals to the next level. Welcome back to this week's episode of Uncontested Investing. Suzanne and I are discussing due diligence essentials for new properties. Suzanne, we've covered a lot so far, but there's still a few more topics that our investor audience needs to hear about, one of which being reviewing title insurance and surveys. This is so important to protect yourself against unseen insurance claims, letting you know what's on the horizon, what you may be financially liable for, really getting into the weeds and understanding everything you can about title and insurance as it pertains to your potential new property.
And there's, title has to be clear. And there could be some liens. Again, we touched on it earlier. A mechanics lien is not a big deal, but there are issues with title insurance that, I always recommend people buying both sides, especially if you're buying it to hold, buying both sides of the title policy, because it really does protect you. And I think it's important that not only that, but even from a survey perspective,
Yeah,
it all ties to a bad survey. As long as it's covered on the title, they go hand in hand.
exactly. So using up-to-date surveys for accurate boundary and easement info is something that every investor is going to want to look into and make sure that their property is up to standard and up to date before they sign on the dotted line.
But that also ties to your surveys are tied to deed and deed easements and stuff like that. So not just finding the surveys not necessarily far enough. You also want to go back at least 20 years on the survey, but I would go back like 50 years on the deeds
Okay.
to make sure there aren't other sides of that equation. And they're very easy to find. Deeds are all recorded just like the surveys are.
Yep.
But it shows you the restrictions that were put in place. And maybe there's an easement across the land that you're unaware of. And you really want to follow through on that.
There you go. The more you know. The last topic we want to discuss is going to be environmental and site assessments when we're talking about a due diligence checklist. So this is one of those ones I feel like it falls into that category of, oh, it'll probably never happen to me. It'll probably never affect me when you're talking about environmental assessments. But conducting a phase one environmental site assessment is, I think, the bare minimum that investors want. Some areas are more affected than others, but even if you have an inkling that could be a possibility, you really want to get that assessment.
Oil tanks, 2 words, oil tanks.
There you go.
And make sure, you want to make sure, have they always been in the house? Has there ever been a leak? But even, and if they've been outside, I go beyond a phase one.
Yep.
Because that's a very costly cleanup.
It's a slippery slope for sure. No pun intended there.
Yeah.
You're also going to want to identify potential contamination or environmental hazards, like Suzanne mentioned, but it can go much farther beyond just your regular oil spill from a tank that was either in or outside of the property. There's a lot of different things that can come into play there. So again, if you ask around, maybe local people in your network, if they've gotten these types of assessments, maybe a company that's performed them in the area, how often have they had to do them? What do those results look like? See if you can ascertain some of that information that'll help you make your final call as an investor, because really what you're going to want to do is plan for remediation if it's necessary. The last thing you want to do is find out too late. But if it's a problem that's worth solving for you, at least you know it ahead of time as an investor and you can plan for it financially and still make that investment work for your bottom line.
And if you're looking at buying a multi-use property where you may have a retail on the first floor and some living space above that, my husband and I did that 30 some odd years ago, and we bought an old hat factory building, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but there is a problem. There's chemicals used in making the hats, and they had to have the second environmental phase 2 of that. Yep. To make sure that there wasn't contamination. And some of those things, so really the due diligence is how has this property been used from its inception?
Yeah.
And that's important. What was here before? What we see what's here today, but what was here before? Was it a farm? What were they doing on the farm? What was raised there? So those are the things that you really want to look at. Like if you're going to be doing a subdivision, really what was on the land prior to that use?
Yep. The more you never know what you're going to uncover when you do the proper due diligence. So that real life example, I think, is super important for our audience to hear. And as with anything that goes in the industry, networking is super important. Networking can make your life so much easier when you're going through this due diligence checklist because you're not going through it alone, right? You have other professionals in the industry you can call, real estate attorneys, surveyors, inspectors, environmental experts. The list goes on, right? So if you're arming yourself with these types of industry professionals, now this checklist doesn't seem so overwhelming because you don't have to go through it alone as an investor.
Well, even talking with the inspectors, the age of the house, they're like, oh, those are asbestos shingles. That has a whole different phase of cleanup. So those are the things that you want to understand, that at the first cursory look, it looks like a great house, recently painted, isn't it special? Unless those are asbestos shingles. And then you have to figure out, well, what do you want to do next?
Yes.
So those are, and your inspectors are going to know that. Those are who your partners are and who you want to garner that information from.
The value of professional advice in these complex situations is so valuable. Whether or not they ultimately end up helping you, sometimes it's just great to have a soundboard as an investor, right? Be able to vent about certain issues, to get expertise. You might not always have to hire them. Some of these industry professionals, as we mentioned, with that pay it forward mentality, they'll just be happy to help and walk you through, okay, if X, Y, and Z comes back on this assessment, this is how I can help you. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, but they can still offer their advice, offer their services. You don't have to be an expert in all of this. You just have to know one.
Well, and to understand, And it's not a end all be all. You just have to understand, what is the lead paint remediation? What are the things that you have to do to bring it to an acceptable current zoning law? Sometimes it's maybe just reduce it off the price, but some of these tasks are not inexpensive.
Yeah. And it may be some trial and error. You might have to go through a few things to really realize what that ultimate checklist is going to be. But you really want to create a due diligence checklist that you have for every investment property. It's the only way that you can reduce that stress, reduce that anxiety, and make sure all your bases are covered before going into this investment property.
And make sure that you can do your testing and the timeline estimated.
Yes.
A lot of times you're saying 5 or 7 days for the inspection, and some of these require more time than that duration, and you don't time yourself out, forcing you to commit to something that may not be the right deal.
Yep. Priority is key, right? Where should I be spending the most of my energy, the most of my attention? Where should I start first on a given property? That's very important. You got to document findings, right? So always keep tabs, keep records of things, make sure that you're aware of everything that's gone on. The last thing you want to do is go through this process that can be sometimes chaotic and let something fall through the cracks that you may have uncovered, but then failed to take care of. And it comes back to bite you once you've crossed the finish line on a deal. So document your findings. Excuse me, I just created a new word. Document your findings and your decision-making process, right? Is there a point in the checklist where if a certain thing or things go wrong or don't get checked off the list, that's when you're going to start wanting to walk away from the property and realize, okay, maybe this one has just too many issues, or I do not want to proceed.
Or also, if you, after you've acquired it, make sure that you keep your both sides of the copy of the property disclosure form, because all of a sudden you have something that creep up. They say, oh, no, we've never had a water damage, or we don't have any mold issues, and they just literally painted over it and it's coming right through the wall. Yeah. So these are things that you still have recourse on if something creeps up that someone wasn't as truthful as they should have been when they initialed that disclosure. Use it to really protect yourself. Keep all of your paperwork as part of your due diligence process.
And it certainly is something that can ease your mind, ease that stress. With so much to cover throughout the life of acquiring an investment property, that checklist in your back pocket can really be your best friend.
Absolutely. It'll give you a history. And even when you go to sell it down the road, you'll have that much more information to share.
So I think with that last talking point, we've completed our checklist. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Uncontested Investing. Again, this was Due Diligence Essentials for New Properties. Suzanne and I covered a lot. We're so happy you could join us, and we will see you next week on Uncontested Investing.
See you soon.
Thank you for listening to Uncontested Investing. Questions about today's episode or the podcast? Email podcast@rcncapital.com and make sure to follow REI Inc. magazine on LinkedIn and Facebook, and RCN Capital on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. See you all next time.